Okay. So, what did your father do after the war?
So he specialized in the topic that he loved even when he was a student, and that was aeronautical engineering. And he worked as an aeronautical engineer for the U.S. Air Force, based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio.
Okay. And the next one maybe is this part you just talked about, and I want to hear something more about when you were growing up. How much or how little did you know your father's heroism?
I knew something of it, but to tell you the truth, I knew a lot of it mainly from the books that I read that talked about it. He he wasn't one to tell the stories of his own volition. You know, if you asked him, he would tell the story. If you wanted more details, he would tell them. But he didn't tell the story all the time, and sometimes I would only know some of the details of what he did, like I said, by reading the books that have already been published of other people talking about it, or sometimes during the reunions of the Doolittle Raiders, because my father he just loved to go to those reunions. He really loved those pilots and wanted to see them every year, and the reunions were held, except for maybe 2 or 3 years, they were held every year after the war. So he always wanted to go. And when he was getting older and a little bit infirm, we children would go with him, you know, sometimes he was in a wheelchair or something like that. So then we would hear him talking to some of these people, these pilots, and then they would reminisce about funny things that happened. And that was always fascinating to me, because some of them were stories that we never really knew about, and then they would start talking about them. So it came out in little pieces like that, piecemeal, which is part of my regret, because it would have been great to, to have everything easily digested in one big chunk with all the details there. But sometimes one person would say one thing and one person would say another thing, and his best friend was Colonel Travis Hoover, the pilot of Crew 2. And Hoover was a hilarious guy, and they stayed good friends until Hoover died himself. And one time he was talking and he said they never practiced to land on a real aircraft carrier. They never really practiced to land on a vessel. They just practiced on land, but was told that the takeoff was really, really short. And he would be shaking his head like, can you imagine how weird that is? And, I was like, that's really something. And that's really cutting it close, I think.
So, did he think he was a hero?
No, my father never he would never call himself a hero. He thought that the Americans, the pilots who he helped, those were the heroes. He just thought of himself as just an ordinary person who did what any Chinese man would do in the same situation.
Yes. So, you're also touched.
Yeah, well, none of them thought they would. Very few of them would actually say, I'm a hero. Even Colonel Cole, who had heroics, the last Doolittle Raider to pass away, he was a hero to the end, but.
And I want to ask one more question. And do you think your father is a hero?
Yes, I do. I do think he was. And I think that very clearly there were several strategic decisions that he made where he could have taken a safer road. He didn't have to stay with them that whole time. He could have interpreted for them and then said, bye-bye, I've got my own life to live and I've got to get someplace. But he didn't do that. And I'm not sure he even considered it for a moment. It just sounded like it was so natural for him to just stay with them and do whatever he could do to help them. It sounded like there was no question in his mind that that's what he would do.
And maybe next one. And how about down here?
This one?
Yes.
Oh, or the other side?
Yeah, the other side. Okay. Okay, that's okay. And next one is, did he attend any of the Doolittle Reader reunion? Reunions? Did you? Yes.
Yes, he loved those reunions, and I also took part in a number of them because he liked to have his family, his whole family there. He'd like to go there when my mother was still alive. He'd like to bring her there. That was another unusual thing about the Doolittle Raider reunions, is that at some point the wives and the kids were part of it. So it wasn't just the older generation of these male pilots getting together. Their wives got together, their wives became friendly with each other, the children grew up with each other, the children became friends with each other, and that was a very unusual, I would say a very unusual thing for these sort of World War II veteran groups. And they met every year, and my father tried to go every year. I think he might have missed out on like a handful only. Once he had open heart surgery. Actually, he had 2 open heart surgeries where he was recovering, so he couldn't go. And maybe at the end of his life, there was 1 or 2 that he missed. But he loved them, and he just would go forever. He would save all the programs and the air tickets and everything. He just loved to get together with them.
So they are friends now. Then.
Yes, very good friends. Uh-huh.
Yes. Yes, it's a very
And
special.
yeah, and my father kept all their Christmas cards too. He had a whole box full of Christmas cards from all the Raiders, and yeah, and he sent Christmas cards to all of them. And yeah, it was quite an exceptional group of people. And what I liked about it, it wasn't just the men getting together, it was the whole families. And of course, that's why we, the children, are still getting together, even though all the older generation are gone.
Yes. Next one maybe. How did he become one of the very few given the title honorary reader?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the only thing I can say to answer that, I'm not the best person to ask it because I'm not one of the people who were making the decision, but from my observation, number one, there were very few honorary raiders. They had to have made an exceptional contribution and have an exceptional connection to the pilots. But also, even though there were many, many Chinese who risked their lives to help rescue raiders, probably in much more life-threatening situations than my father had been in, but the vast, vast majority of those Chinese people never came to the States and never knew the raiders in the States. And so the connection didn't continue through time, whereas my father was one who did. And, and my father himself never planned to stay in the States for the rest of his life. He fully thought that he would go back to China, after studying for a few years and have advanced degrees and be able to, design aircraft in China. Whereas instead it worked out that he ended up doing that in the United States.
Okay, so why was the group Children of the Doolittle Readers organized? Maybe you just mentioned, yes?
Right. Well, again, I might not be the best person to ask because I wasn't always present for the meetings where this decision came about. But it wasn't like all of a sudden, oh, let's do this. It was, there was an idea to keep the legacy going, and that an idea that the younger generation should be part of that. That went on for a number of years, and there were attempts to start an organization called the Children of the Doolittle Raiders, or something like that. But for a number of years, I was not involved at all because, for me, my job was journalism, and I was a foreign correspondent, so I wasn't even living in the States. And I was very, very busy for a number of years. I covered the war in Afghanistan and the fall of the Taliban. I covered the war in Iraq and the fall of Saddam. Covered the Olympics in China, 2008. And so it was probably around the time after the Olympics in China that I became more interested in, this group that, in my mind, my father belongs to and has reunions and whatnot. And I think because my workload was not quite so intense after 2008, so I spent more time with my family and went to a number of these reunions. And the Children of the Doolittle Raiders idea was kind of percolating among the children of the pilots and the airmen, and it didn't. How should we put it? I would say it didn't gain critical mass for a little while, but probably that's natural. Like it wasn't known how, would they incorporate as a nonprofit, illegally become a nonprofit in the States? How would they have a constitution? How would they choose their leader? This sort of thing. And there were a couple of people heading it, with plans to do things, but I think that one of the big motivations for having this was a deep desire among the children to see China, to see what is this country that our fathers had so many adventures in and changed their lives, and that we've heard about, but almost none of them, except for me, had ever been here. And so very early on, even before I was deeply involved in it, there was an idea that, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to all have a big group and come back to China. And of course, in those days, there were a few pilots still alive, so the idea was maybe some of these old guys can actually come with us and travel around China. Unfortunately, it never happened that way, but I think one of the action points that they wanted to do was to do a trip.
Yes. So next one, please talk about the 2018 CDR trip to China. Where did you go? What did you say? Who did you meet?
Right. Well, again, it kind of developed organically. Like I said, there was this idea, hey, let's go to China, as if it was easy. It wasn't easy to organize that trip, but the idea was there for a long time. I think there were some travel agents that had been discussing it, and it never quite happened. And there were a couple of things that kind of pushed it along. One of them was still the hope that maybe one of the surviving Doolittle Raiders could come with us. But they were getting really old. At one point, there were only 4 of them, and the chances of any of them at that age being able to come along was kind of diminishing very quickly. The next thing that was happening is that among the children of the Doolittle Raiders, not only was there a great desire to go to China, but some people were, they had been working for many decades, they had saved a little money, maybe they had some vacation time saved up. they were beginning to feel like, oh, I can take some time now. I can spend the money that it'll take to get to China, or something like that. And then the election of Jeff Thatcher, who is the president of the Children of the Doolittle Raiders, added another impetus, because in his capacity as the head of the Children of the Doolittle Raiders, was invited to come to China by the Chinese government to take part in a to observe a big military parade celebrating the end of World War II, essentially. And so on his own, he came, and I saw him here, but before he came, I said, Jeff, you really should come not just to watch the parade, but you can ask the Chinese officials who invited you if we can go down to Zhejiang, where your father landed, and see the beach where he landed, and see the hospital that took care of your father's crew. And he said, okay, let me try. And they did, to their credit. The Chinese who invited him said, okay, we'll give you another 3 days, go ahead. So that was sort of like the reconnaissance mission for the larger trip. Jeff came, my husband and I went down to Zhejiang with him. We had an amazing time. His eyes were opened to the deep feelings of the Chinese people, all these very friendly Chinese, and we saw a few sights, and then and then he went back home. And it was based on the extreme success of that small trip that was just Jeff and me and my husband, that became the model for the larger trip that the whole group would go on. So we started talking about it. It turns out that one of the Children of the Doolittle Raiders wives was a professional travel agent, so she could help make some of the arrangements. We set up an itinerary. We got all the hotels and everything. And so, basically people flew into Beijing and saw some of the sites in Beijing, including Tiananmen Square and what I call the World War II Museum in Beijing. Some people call it the Marco Polo Museum, of the Chinese war against Japanese aggression. And it had been remodeled not too long ago, and there was a big picture of the Doolittle, one of the crew of the Doolittle Raiders there, so that was great fun. And from Beijing, we went to Zhejiang. We sort of followed in the footsteps to the degree that we could, without going too far afield. I mean, if we really wanted to go to everybody's father's landing spot, we'd still be there probably. It would have taken a long time. But we plotted an itinerary where we went to Chuzhou, which was a meeting point for a lot of the, almost all of the raiders who survived. We went to an old air raid shelter where a lot of them stayed, where my father also had stayed. Near Chuzhou, we went to Jiangshan, where some of the crews had landed, and we met some of the families of Chinese who had helped those Americans. So in other words, the children of the Chinese rescuers were meeting the children of the American pilots that were rescued. So that was very emotional. That was very, I would say, satisfying and moving and dramatic for a lot of the group. So there were 24 of us in the Children of the Doolittle Raiders, and we had remarkable reception. The local government officials were very welcoming. In Chuzhou, we actually attended the opening ceremony of a memorial hall to the Doolittle Raiders, which was just created in a traditional Chinese house with a lot of artifacts that were loaned by the CDR. We also we gave out some scholarship awards to some Chinese students that with a school of the number 2 middle school in Chuzhou, which is a very modest scholarship program, but ongoing. And in the end, we ended up in Shanghai, which of course, is such a famous place, and also a place where a number of the raiders actually stayed in a notorious prisoner of war detention facility called Bridge House. So we visited that place, which is now just a regular apartment house in Shanghai, but with a rather dark history. And it was a huge success. And again, I think it opened people's eyes, even for the children of the Doolittle Raiders, who pretty much knew where we were going and what we were going to do. To know it intellectually is quite different to experience it as real in the here and now. They just had a wonderful time. And I think for many of them, it was the first time they had gone overseas. So it was like an eye-opening experience for them.
Yes, very meaningful. Yes. And do you need drink some water?
No, I think I'm okay.
Okay. Some more questions?
I'm probably getting a little shiny or something, but just tell me if I need to put any powder or anything on.
Oh, yes, that's
Yeah.
okay.
It's okay?
Yes,
It's okay.
it's okay.
Okay, good.
Yes. So talk about the CBR scholarship program for Chinese students, please.
Right, okay. So this was, again, this was something that Jeff Thatcher, in his capacity as president of the Children of the Doolittle Raiders, was very interested to do. And it's, okay, we had, this past year was a little bit disrupted because of the pandemic. None of us could go down there. We weren't able to give out the awards yet for the last batch. But basically, students, middle school students who are studying English are invited to write an English language essay related to the Doolittle Raiders, World War II, what does it mean to them, or some other reflections upon it. And some of them are really excellent essays, very good command of English. And then a small committee judges them and ranks them, and small awards are given out to everyone, more to the people whose essays were judged to be better, but in the end everybody gets some kind of award. And yeah, and it's it's something that just some small way that the children of the Doolittle Raiders can contribute to the local communities and families that help them.
Yes.
No, help their fathers, actually.
Yes, of course. And what is the legacy of the Doolittle Raid and the raiders themselves, do you think?
I think it's correct to ask both. I think the Doolittle Raid and the Doolittle Raiders, even though they're obviously have huge commonality, I think the legacy is slightly different in the sense that the legacy of the Doolittle Raid, I think, was very clear and very obvious almost immediately with the success of the bombing of Tokyo. Okay, what did it teach? Well, I think it taught that when they want to, Americans can be faced with, a mission that nobody thought they could do, the unthinkable task, and yet they thought of a way to do it. The mission that people thought would be impossible to do, and yet they made it possible. There were so many innovations and sort of bold new concepts that went into that bombing raid. Most people looking at it would have just said, it's a suicide mission, forget about it. And indeed, it was described as, you volunteer for it, you may never come back. This is a very dangerous mission. And certainly when, because they had to take off earlier than planned, that's when everyone thought, oh, it really is a suicide mission. Fortunately, it didn't turn out to be that way for most of them, but it seemed like Mission Impossible, and yet they did the impossible. So I think that was a wake-up call for everybody, including Americans. I mean, the rising of the uplifting of morale, public morale in the United States was huge, but also around the world, it said, "Oh my God, you know, these planes came out of nowhere and they bombed Tokyo, which nobody thought, at least of all the Japanese high command, nobody thought that would be possible. They can do anything they want to do." But the legacy of the raiders, the people who did it, I think there's another aspect to it, and you know, an equally important aspect of it. The Doolittle Raiders as people, their story and their narrative and their narratives, because I think there's one big story, but then there are also many individual stories, because, you know, they were split up after the bombing of Tokyo, and they landed it. A lot of them just landed all by themselves. They were hanging off of trees. They were hanging near cliffs. They were, you know, in the water, and they met Chinese people who, despite so many challenges, helped them. Okay, so what was the legacy of that? I think, again, it was, you know, the relationships that you thought would be impossible. You know, who could have imagined that, you know, my father, a Chinese student of engineering, would suddenly become thrown in the same room with a bunch of American pilots, and that they would become such great friends, changing all of their lives. You know, and some of the other Chinese were, you know, literally fishermen, you know, farmers, part bandits. You know, they were totally not the people that you would expect to be able to get along with any kind of foreigner. Some of them didn't even know what nationality these white guys were. They thought, are they Japanese? And they've never seen anybody like that before. So, and yet, despite all those challenges and all those cultural differences, they found a way to communicate, they found a way to move together, they found a way to escape, and they found a way to help each other. And I think that legacy, it just continues on and on. I mean, that's what the children of the Doolittle Raiders is all about. You know, some of those people, they never had traveled anywhere before. Suddenly, they're in the middle of Zhejiang province, and they're wandering around and eating all kinds of strange food, and they loved it. And so, what that teaches is that you know, no matter how different the backgrounds, the cultures, the ethnic identities, the nationalities, you know, the governments, that there's still ways for human beings to relate to each other and to help each other survive. I think that's the legacy.